Hi, friends. This is Blaine DeSantis. I welcome you to another edition of Books and Looks. Yes, it's our weekly voyage of discovery in the wonderful world of books. Books that I've been reading and authors I've been interviewing. And today, we have got back one of my favorite people. His name is Chris Wimmer. Chris is the author of the book The Summer of 1876. It came out a year ago. We're talking about how things have progressed with his book. You're going to learn a lot about American history. The Summer of 1876. Let me just show you this book. There it is. The Summer of 1876 by Chris Wimmer. This is a book you want to get. I'm going to tell you what, this is a 5-star plus book for me. It's out of this world. We're talking about George Armstrong Custer, Little Bighorn. We talk about Bat Masterson. We talk about Wyatt Earp. We talk about Bill Hickok. We talk about the beginning of baseball, the National League. We talk about all these things. All this is in this book. It's out of this world. We're learning about American history that they don't teach you. Don't teach your kids, your grandchildren. If you don't want to read it, get it for your kids, get it for your grandchildren. Have them read it and learn about what's going on. Not only that, Chris is going to talk to us about his podcast. Now, friends, I want you to watch my podcast. But if you can't watch mine or you said, I'm finished playing, what should I do? Go to Chris Wimmer's podcast. They're out of this world. Legends of the Old West, Infamous America, they're out of this world. You're going to learn a lot about America that is never taught or which we have forgotten. So anyway, I think you're going to like this. I'm so happy to have him back. I'm so happy I can call him a friend. Let's go right to my interview with Chris Wimmer. Chris, welcome to Books and Looks.
Thank you, and thank you for having me back. I can't believe it's been a year since our first chat. We're probably going to get to that in a second, but thank you very much for bringing me back. I'm honored.
Well, happy to have you. As I said, friends, Chris was one of our first YouTubes that we did, but that was before you could see him. Now we're all in living color. And I don't know if that's good or bad, but you can at least see us now. And
I don't know if that's better. I don't know if this is better or worse, but we'll find out.
I think it'll be much better. But, he was on a year ago. He had just brought out his book, and that's what we're going to be talking about it today. The same book, but a year later. You get the perspective of an author as to what's going on in that year. So let's start out talking about The Summer of 1876, a wonderful book. Tell me, have you been pleased by the reception to that book?
Yeah, unexpectedly, it's been unexpectedly successful, at least as far as I was concerned. And I guess I should qualify that by saying it ended up being such a rush to finish writing the book before the deadline that I didn't really give a whole lot of thought as to how it might be received. It was just, I was solely focused on just get the thing done. I've got a deadline, just get it done. And then afterwards, when it was done and when it got released a year after I finished writing it, I was very pleasantly surprised that people not only bought it, but seemed to like it. So it has been a fun, validating experience to see that it actually worked out because it was done so quickly and there was so much work to it that I'm really thrilled it worked out well.
Well, friends, if you have not gone to my website, which is viewsonbooks.com, my review of this book is there. Over 1,200 people have read that review, which I think is a tribute to that man right there, to Chris Wimmer. It is such a quality book. You want to read that review. You want to get that book. It's wonderful. And like I said, it's the top book on my website. And so I'm real happy to have Chris back to talk about this.
Thank you to everyone who reviewed it and read that post. That's great.
Yep. So this is your first book, if I'm not mistaken. Why did you decide to write The Summer of 1876? And why did you think that was the season that basically defined the American West?
Well, part one there, why did I decide to write it? I think the idea came to me when I was about a year to a year and a half into the production of one of my podcasts, which I'm sure we'll talk about later in the interview. But in having read so many books about so many of the key figures and key events in the Old West time period, over the course of that first year of producing the Legends of the Old West podcast, it occurred to me that I had never read a book that put a lot of those big names and big events into one text. They were all separated. There were tons of books about the Little Bighorn and about Wild Bill Hickok and about Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson and Deadwood and all these different places and events and people. But no one had written a book that combined a lot of the things that happened in a very short space of time in that one summer of 1876. And to move on to part two of your question there, that it has started to sit with me. It started to become a little more evident to me that I've become much more comfortable and started to believe that that period, let's call it the second half of the 1870s, let's say 1875 to about 1880 or 1881. To me, I would call it the peak of the Old West period. It's when the biggest names that most people in the world know were all still around. They were still doing something. And a lot of times it was the biggest thing that they were known for. To put it in very generic terms, like most people, when they hear the name George Armstrong Custer, they think of the Little Bighorn. The same with Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. Wild Bill Hickok, despite all of his long history and everything that he did, he's probably most known for his time in Deadwood. And you could certainly make an argument that, most people know Wyatt Earp from his time in Tombstone and the gunfight at the OK Corral, but his story really kicks into high gear with his time in Dodge City in the summer of 1876 when he partners with Bat Masterson for the first time. And Jesse James, and I could go on and on and on. But it's that summer, and then maybe that 5 year period of, let's say, or 6 year period from 1875 to about 1881, for me is really the peak. It's when the Old West towns that everybody knows from the movies, they're all up and running. There's lawmen walking the dusty streets. There's outlaws robbing banks. There's cattle drives nonstop from Texas up to Kansas. There's Native American wars all across the West. Basically, everything is happening in that time period.
And it's interesting because one of yours and my favorite authors, I think Tom Clavin's got a new book out about Bandit Heaven or something like that. And I was amazed how things had changed by the time Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid came along. Completely different.
Yeah, they're right at the end of the period that we typically call the Old West. I think you can define it in lots of different ways. I think the most common definition of the Old West era of American history is from 1865, the end of the Civil War, to about 1900. And they are obviously Butch and Sundance are at the very end of that time period. And you can certainly bleed the Old West era into the early 1900s, but generally speaking, 1900 is considered the cutoff. And so, yeah, by the time they're robbing trains and going through all of their exploits, we are really in the waning days of the Old West. All the other famous outlaws are gone. There's a lot of transformation, and the West is very different from what it was even just a few years earlier in the 1870s.
That's right. Well, now you touched just a bit about it, but for those who may have missed it last time you were here and have not read the book, tell us a little bit about the summer of 1876.
The basic premise was to really highlight the overlap in several big stories that all happened in what I usually call about a 90-day window of time. And those big stories are the Battle of the Little Bighorn in June of 1876, the first partnership between Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson in Dodge City in the summer of 1876, when Dodge City was entering the world as the new big hub for Texas cattle drives. It had been around for a couple years, but as the railroad moved west across Kansas, each new town became the new hotspot for cattle drives. In the summer of 1876, it was Dodge City's turn. It became the queen of the cow towns beginning in that summer. And then it's the end of the Wild Bill Hickok story. Hickok tries to go find his fortune in Deadwood. And for those who know the end of the story, probably don't have to tell it to you. For those who don't know how that story ends, I won't give it away. But the end of the Wild Bill Hickok story happens in that summer of 1876. And then the other really big storyline, I know I probably said 5 earlier, but it's more like 4.5. The other really big one is the story of Jesse James. Jesse James has a roller coaster ride of a summer of 1876. He robs a train in Missouri, which ends up going very bad. And then he experiences his horror story, which is the Great Northfield Raid, the disastrous robbery of a bank in Northfield, Minnesota, and then the epic journey to escape the law after that disastrous bank robbery. So those big stories, all set against the backdrop of the first World's Fair in Philadelphia, is happening at that same time, where all the debuts of all the new inventions. I could have written an entire book about that, and I'm sure people have. So that's happening. There's a presidential election going on. There's the first season of National League Baseball, which is the 5th storyline that I mentioned earlier. The National League was formed in February of 1876. And so their first season of National League is playing that whole summer while all those other things are happening. So people in what we now call the Midwest of the United States and the East Coast were far more interested in what was going on with the baseball scores than they were about what's happening in this little mining camp of Deadwood that they haven't really heard of. And a cow town called Dodge City in Kansas, and of course the Little Bighorn becomes worldwide news. But still, there's a real bifurcation between East and West in that time period, where the people in the East are totally concerned about other things. The people in the West are living a whole different life.
So you bring this all together, all at one period of time. You go from one to the other, back to this and that. It makes me ask you: was there one event that you thought was it was better or more important than any of the other events you documented?
Well, certainly the most impactful was the Battle of the Little Bighorn, on a lot of different ways. On a physical level for the soldiers of the Seventh Cavalry who fought in that battle. The American psyche took a huge hit when the nation learned that the guy they had been told and had believed was the number one Indian fighter, which is what he was typically called, George Armstrong Custer, was killed in what was generally called a massacre at that time. Um, the fact that a Native American army had thoroughly annihilated at least a detachment of the U.S. Army, which was unthinkable, even though 10 years earlier, Red Cloud and a Lakota and Cheyenne army had done a very similar thing. They had successfully defeated a small portion of the U.S. Army in roughly the same areas where the Little Bighorn happened. Still, it was a huge blow to the American psyche, and that was incredibly impactful, not only on political and U.S. Army strategic maneuvers, but the American psyche, and then of course on the flip side for the Native American societies who fought in that battle, who regarded it as a pretty sizable action in the moment, but after the fact, the Northern Cheyenne especially didn't really view the Little Bighorn as this gargantuan, epic event in their history. It was just another battle with blue coat soldiers. To them, it really wasn't that big of a deal. But then the impact of it afterwards, how the U.S. Army really pushed into the West and ended up eventually forcing all the societies onto reservations. The victory was in American history. It's one of the ultimate Pyrrhic victories. It was a victory for the Native American societies, but ultimately it led to a loss, and they ended up being forced onto reservations.
Well, now, as we look at all these stories, was it hard to find source material or research that was accurate? There are a lot of myths and there are a lot of legends about the West and everything. Was it hard to find a good quality source material?
For these stories, not necessarily. It actually, because these are fairly well known stories. There's been a lot written about them. They have been researched endlessly by lots of great historians and academics and researchers over the years. So these are like the top level, top line, headline making stories of not only that one summer and that year of 1876, but some of the top in American history, and certainly the Old West time period. So luckily, there was a lot of reliable information. Now, even with that said, there will always be debate about all kinds of things. I mean, no matter the further back in history you go, the less anyone can agree on anything. So it just comes with the territory. There will always be people who will argue and nitpick tiny little things because they've done a ton of research on that one little thing and they have a very steadfast opinion of it. And so I've run into that a few times. But really, that there was pretty reliable information, and that's what I always want to qualify with the book. The book is not a deep dive into any one of those storylines. The whole point of the book was to show the overlap. So I stuck to more of the overview while trying to layer in enough detail to really give you an impression of what each story felt like at the time. But I didn't go as deep in any one of the storylines as you can certainly read about in other books. So to that regard, I didn't necessarily have to read every single journal entry of every single soldier who participated in the Little Bighorn. That wasn't the point.
Now, again, we're looking, excuse me, we're looking a year after publication. Have you ever thought, is there one event that maybe I should have included in the book that I didn't include?
I haven't discovered anything of sizable note. I have learned a few things since then with the natural production of the Legends of the Old West podcast and the stories I keep telling. I run up against smaller stories that had at least a slice of the overall story happened in that summer of 1876. But I don't think anything that was so notable that it would have qualified as to be given the weight of all the other five major storylines in there.
Okay. Well, that's good. Then
Luckily,
you hit it all.
luckily for
Yeah.
me.
Friends, as I'm talking to Chris, yeah, a lot of you, I know I have listeners over in Europe, England, Romania, Spain, Italy, you name it, plus here. But a lot of you may not have heard of Wild Bill Hickok. You might not have heard about Jesse James. You might not have heard about George Armstrong Custer. It's all covered there. And you don't have to have a degree in American history to read this book and enjoy this. Chris has taken all that stuff and combined it into a highly enjoyable, readable book that just is so good. And it teaches us what was going on back then, which they don't teach anymore here in America. We don't know about it unless it's in the movies or in a book like this. You don't see it anymore. Isn't that frustrating?
Yeah, that's been one of the many, many lessons I learned, and I've continued to learn in the production of the podcast and both in the production of the book, that the stories that end up interesting people the most are almost inevitably the ones that get skipped over by our American history books. This Old West time period gets shortchanged in the world of American history and the history books, and within that, the subset of Native American stories really gets glossed over or framed in the wrong way or just simply ignored in some cases. And so what I've discovered is the people who listen to Legends of the Old West podcast, they love the stories of the outlaws and the lawmen and the bank robberies and the train robberies and that classic stuff. But they really seem to respond and write in and tell us how much they like the Native American stories, because they simply don't get any of that. And it's a real blank spot in American history as kids are growing up and going through school, certainly depending on where you live. But that's why I hope that, as you just mentioned, the book is hopefully it provides people a really good overview of the time, the place, and a whole variety of different characters and different events.
It's a wonderful book. Now we talk about you being a podcaster. What was your journey into becoming a podcaster? And I think your sister is part of the whole production, if I'm not mistaken. Tell us a little bit about that, Chris.
It was weird and random and spontaneous, and probably even more so for my sister. In that I my first career was working in the film industry in Hollywood, and I got burned down on it and wasn't having the success that I had hoped for. And I made a transition to the world of journalism and thought if I was going to do anything other than try to write and sell screenplays, it would be to write about college football, American college football. And I started on that journey. And during that transitional period, I was learning about these things called podcasts and starting to explore the world of podcasts and started seeing some of the level of creativity that some people were putting into podcasts, and especially nonfiction podcasts like American history podcasts. There were some people out there, for instance, Lindsey Graham, who produces American History Tellers. His show was a really good early inspiration with its production and sound design and music and the storytelling. I thought, oh man, this is amazing. This is something I might want to try to do. So as I was going through the transition into the world of sports journalism and becoming addicted to podcasts, I started leaning into the idea that I wanted to take a lot of the pent up frustration of not being able to sell screenplays and going through all the bureaucracy of Hollywood, and maybe use a podcast as an outlet and try to make one of these things myself. If I could make it myself and figure out how to do all the different things that were required, I could release it directly to the audience. I didn't need to go through 17 different layers of permissions and contracts and notes from other people. If I could make it, I could deliver it to the audience. And that was really appealing to me. So I started Legends of the Old West while I was working at a small newspaper in Texas. And the podcast was just a total side project. And it quickly grew into something that I thought I could turn into a business potentially. At the very least, my sister and I had already been talking about starting some kind of business to combine our various experiences and skill sets. She comes from a world of mega event productions. She had worked on multiple Super Bowls and the centennial anniversary event for the state of Arizona. She'd worked on these huge level events, and we thought if we could take our various production abilities and combine them into one company, that would be pretty cool. And so I called her out of the blue and said, "Hey, this little Old West podcast seems to be doing fairly well, and I'm not really sure about this whole sports writing thing that I've now started. Maybe we should try to start a company that produces podcasts." And my sister jumped right in with both feet, to her immense credit, and brought in the tiny little bit of seed funding that we used to start the business. And at that time, she had never even heard of a podcast. She had no idea what a podcast was. She didn't know how you produced any of these things, how you market them, let alone how you might be able to make a business out of one of them and actually make money off of it. All of that stuff was unknown. So we did it a little bit backwards and had the beginnings of a product that we then tried to transform into a business. and it has been a nonstop experimental. And I mentioned roller coaster ride earlier with regard to Jesse James. We have been on a nonstop roller coaster ride for 6.5 years now.
Wow. Wow. I love them. I love all your podcasts. I can't get enough of them.
Thank you. I'm glad you do. I'm glad you do, and lots of other people do. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this conversation. None of this would be happening.
Well, now you, as of right now, I think you're personally doing three of them, if I'm not mistaken. You have Legends of the Old West, you have Infamous America, and you had a new one you started called Mission History. Are you still doing all three of those?
Yes, to a degree. Two of the three, absolutely. Legends of the Old West and Infamous America, which were both started back in 2018. Those are regularly producing podcasts. We're still working on those. We've got years worth of stories we can still tell on those before the well might start to run dry. We'll see. Luckily, with American history, certainly with American criminal history, it's a bottomless well. At some point, maybe the Old West has more of a finite term limit on it, but still, we've got tons and tons of stories to tell there. Mission History was one that had an interesting origin story last year. That we were contacted by a historical group called the Camden Foundation in Camden, South Carolina. So for South Carolina listeners, this will really tie into your home state. And anyone who knows the small town of Camden outside Columbia, there was an incredible and yet disastrous battle that happened there during the Revolutionary War, where the American side got crushed by the British side, but it ended up also being one of the two kind of twin turning points of the Revolutionary War for the American side. That specific Battle of Camden ended in a terrible loss, but it ultimately propelled the American Southern Army to success. So we were contacted by the Camden Foundation to produce a podcast series about the Battle of Camden that would focus on two specific units that were the big ones that fought in that battle: the Maryland Regiment, which is typically a combined regiment of Maryland and Delaware soldiers, and the Scottish Highlanders on the British side. And so I ended up weaving together those two units and their histories into the overall story of the American Revolutionary War. So season 1 of Mission History is a 10-episode epic about the American Revolutionary War. And then the hope was always that we would develop the Mission History podcast into a military campaign oriented podcast, and we would highlight big military campaigns from around world history. So the Roman campaigns, the Punic Wars, the season 2, which I hope to still be able to do at some point, is becoming a long rambling answer, would be hopefully the story of William Wallace and the Scottish rebellions, about 400 years of Scottish rebellion. So take that Scottish unit who fought with the British in the American Revolutionary War and trace their histories back in time to when they were rebels and rebelling against the British, and go through William Wallace and Robert the Bruce and the Jacobite Rebellion and all those great stories from that medieval time period. We just haven't gotten to it yet. There's a lot going on behind the scenes, and I desperately want to get that podcast Mission History back up and running, but it's just long delayed at this point.
Well, then we talk about here. It's Infamous America, and you hinted it's about crimes. what type of crimes, and when is there a time period, or just all over the place?
Yeah, we call it a historical true crime show. It was initially started in that, and the reason we called it Infamous America is that we don't. It's not even necessarily pigeonholed as a crime show. Most of anything that you would qualify with the word infamous falls under the category of crime. There's some sort of crime related to that word, but we called it Infamous America because it doesn't necessarily have to be crime oriented. For instance, I think you can make an argument that the story of the Salem witch trials, which was season 1 of the Infamous America podcast, is not really a crime story. It could be viewed that way, but it's not necessarily a crime story.
Well, now, Chris, how many seasons have you had of Infamous America, and how long is a season?
Well, the second part of the question is really easy to answer, thankfully. Each season is always 6 episodes long. With the exception of maybe, depending on when people listen to this, we're going to do a little mini series at the end of 2024. That'll only be three episodes, but generally speaking, after a certain point, I don't remember when that was, I standardized all the seasons to be 6 episodes. So some of the early seasons fluctuate in length, but now they're all 6 episodes. In terms of number of seasons on Infamous America specifically, man, I think I know we're in the 30s, 33, 34, 35 seasons, something like that. Somewhere approaching between 200 and 250 episodes on that podcast. and then a few more on Legends of the Old West since it started earlier.
I'm going to say Legends is at least at 33, 34 episodes already.
Yeah, it's at 30. We're on season 35 or 36, again, depending on when your listeners listen to this. But it's, it's also in that neighborhood of roughly 250 total episodes. So anyone who happens to hear about these podcasts for the first time, and if you enjoy them, you've got a lot of back catalog to go to go listen to.
You will spend a lot of time listening to his stuff. If you don't know what to do when it's raining or it's snowing, just put on his stuff and listen to it. It's
If you've got a long road trip, if you've got a brutal commute in Los Angeles or something, you're trapped in the car for 2 hours. There you go.
yeah, no doubt about it. Well, and again, Legend of the Old West does talk about the Old West, basically that post Civil War era. That's the area you cover.
Mostly, yes. We've actually just now started to expand the time frame that we're using for the Old West podcast because we got so many requests for stories like the Mountain Men that happened before the Old West time period that as we discussed earlier, that's typically starts around 1865. There's all those the early days of the American frontier when the frontier was the Appalachian Mountains and things like Ohio and parts of Kentucky, and those things were the frontier. And so people want to hear those stories that fit thematically of Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett and and Jim Bridger and the Alamo and all those stories that technically happened earlier than the Old West, but still really fit with the idea. So I've just started introducing those stories. So we're now doing what I've started calling a subset of Legends of the Old West that I call American Frontier stories. So an American Frontier story on Legends of the Old West, and those American Frontier stories will be the ones that are technically earlier than 1865.
My God, you're busy.
Yeah, too busy, actually, it turns out.
First of all, and I was going to get to this a little bit later on. How do you have a voice left anymore? Because you do all the narration for these, and they're not 10-minute podcasts. These are long shows.
Yeah, each episode we try to get it to about 30 minutes, so they're anywhere between about 25 and the first series that we just did on the American Frontier, which is stories of three mountain men. Those are long episodes. Those are in the 35 to 45-minute range. And yeah, I'm not a professional narrator. I have forced myself into that role and have luckily gotten better at it over time, but yeah, my voice gets strained just doing this interview. So recording 2 to 3 episodes, if I have to record 3 episodes in a day, I sound like a zombie by the end of it, and it gets a little rough.
Also, it's hard to keep your enthusiasm level up. After a while, it's just like, I keep going.
Yeah, and we really try to focus on the action with the series. Like I'm under no illusions. I understand that as much as people might like the history and the deeper stuff, it's the action that drives these stories. People want to hear about bank robberies and shootouts and all that kind of fun action oriented stuff. And when you narrate that stuff, it requires a little more performance, at least to the ability that I'm able to. Like I said, I'm not a performer, I'm not an actor. The really good audiobook narrators, for those people who might be listening to this who love audiobooks, those people are amazing. It gives you a whole new appreciation when you have to sit there, and I guess I should say myself, and sit there and read out loud, which is a thing most people don't do. When you have kids, maybe you read children's books out loud, but nobody sits in their bedroom and just reads a book out loud for 30 minutes straight. And it's far more difficult than most people realize. So those really good audiobook narrators, they are true performers. They are amazing.
And here's something, I don't know if you caught this little fact in the last week. For the period of January through June of 2024, for the first time ever, more audiobooks were sold than ebooks.
You're kidding. I did not know that, but that is a very good tidbit to have. I'm going to stash that away for upcoming meetings that I have going on as I'm constantly pushing the idea of audio, and not to go too deep down that particular rabbit hole to keep using that phrase, but the great thing about podcasts and what I loved about them in those early days of 2014, 2015, 2016, as I was learning about them and realizing what they were and seeing the potential of them. Audio is the only truly mobile form of entertainment that exists. You can't watch a YouTube video while you're driving your car to work. You can't read an ebook while you're driving your car to work or while you're hiking up a mountain or something like that. Audio is still the only medium that can do those things. And we are not in, until the time we have self-driving cars and flying cars and stuff like that, where maybe you could turn on a movie for your commute. We're not there yet. So in the meantime, audio is the only truly mobile form. And with the creativity that's available, it's exciting to hear that now audiobooks are starting to overtake ebooks, because that will only help fuel some of the fires that I'm burning over here on this end.
Well, it's fascinating. In 2 weeks, we're going to have an author on. His name is Evan Friss. Uh, he wrote a history of the American bookstore. And he's going to be taking us, nonfiction book, from the beginning back with Ben Franklin, the old corner up in Boston, all the way up to current times. And a lot's happened since that was published 3 months ago. In the last 3 months, Costco announced they're no longer selling books. We have now more Audible books than ebooks. What's going to happen to the bookstore?
Yeah, and to piggyback off that, it's interesting you say that. And number one, I can't wait to hear that episode and then read that book. Bookstores are my happy place, like they are for a lot of people. Certainly, when I was a kid, as I'll go on a little tangent here, when the parents would take you to the mall and they needed to go do the shopping, I would bolt and run to the old Walden bookstores. For people who were of a certain age, remember Walden books? They used to be ubiquitous in American shopping malls. And then, of course, Borders and Barnes and Noble and all those other bookstores that used to be around back in those days. That's where I would go, just spend my time. My mom would go off and do whatever shopping she needed, and I would be hanging out in the bookstore. Now it's, of course, it's much more difficult to do that, and therefore I appreciate bookstores even more, the ones that are still around. And as we record this here in August of 2024, I'm on a big road trip throughout the American West for several different reasons. One of those reasons was to go do a private event at the Buffalo Bill Cody Center of the West in Cody, Wyoming, which is an incredible set of 5 museums in one building. If you've never been there, it's awesome. So I did a little event there, and then I did a book signing at their local independent bookstore, which is called Legends Bookstore. So it was perfect, a tie-in for the Legends of the Old West podcast and the book. And it is one of those quintessential classic little family-owned bookstores right there on Main Street in Cody, Wyoming. It's awesome, and it's the kind of place I could spend an entire day in. And I really hope those are able to stick around, and hopefully your guest is able to show us that even though a lot of them have gone away, hopefully there is still some interest in keeping those, at least very least, the small family-owned independent bookstores around. We need those.
No doubt about that. No doubt. Well, we'll talk to Evan in a couple weeks about that. And, you know, you do a lot of research for your shows. Uh, do you do all that, or do you have a staff that does that, or do you write the script? How do you get into that whole thing?
It's a mix. Initially, I was doing all the research and all the writing for both podcasts, and that quickly wasn't sustainable if we were going to produce series on a regular basis. We had to start expanding the lineup basically. So now we work with a series of freelance writers who do the original research and writing, and then I usually put a polish on the scripts at the end of the process. So most of our series are now written, initially researched and written by other people, and I do my own polish on the scripts. But there are some stories that I still do fully research and write myself. I tend to lean toward making sure I'm the one who's doing the Texas Ranger stories as stories that I really like, and I've now kind of taken ownership on and responsibility of. And then a lot of the Native American stories, I want to make sure that if I want to do those myself, and if something goes wrong, then I'm to blame, and that's how it goes. If they work out well, great. But I've also somewhat taken ownership of those, so it's a mix. I do some research and writing for both podcasts, but we work with a lot of other really good people in between.
Well, you're a busy man, I'll tell you that. Now, do you think the American West, that time period we're talking about, the West, do you think that's your favorite era of American history?
I would call it 1A and 1B. And I think I've talked about this previously, but maybe not too much publicly. My first idea for a podcast was to do a Civil War podcast, an American Civil War podcast. I love Civil War history. I've always been fascinated with it. I've read a lot about it and watched endless documentaries. But when I was starting to scout for potential topics to do a podcast about, there was already a Civil War podcast up and running that looked like it was pretty well established and it was going to keep going. So I thought I didn't want to tread into waters where someone was already, swimming. So I picked the Old West as the 1B. Like they're interchangeable for me. The Civil War and the Old West are my two favorite periods of American history. And so it was a natural pivot to go with the Old West when it was time to start up a podcast.
Well, that's it's worked out very well for you. And You've written one highly successful book. Do you have another book you want to write? Or is a book not in your foreseeable future with how busy you are?
Both, as a matter of fact. It's one of the reasons I'm on this big road trip throughout the West here in the late summer of 2024 is that I'm scouting stories for a potential new book. There is an idea that I've talked about with my book agent and think has some merit to it, and it would be somewhat similar in form to the first book, where it would tell a series of stories that in this book potentially they're not necessarily overlapping stories. They're more consecutive stories that are all somewhat linked together. And so I'm on part of this road trip is to see some of the locations where these stories happen, see if there is viability for the book, if it really is a good idea to try to write it. And what I'm learning is that I'm on the fence. I don't know if this concept is really has the merit that I thought it did in the beginning of the process. And I'm also learning that the sheer volume of research I'm going to have to do to write this book might make it prohibitive at this point anyway. It might take me years to do the research. And so I just don't know if I'm going to put that kind of time and energy into it. So I might actually move off of this concept and move to a couple other options, which I do think would be interesting and follow the same kind of format. I really like the idea of showing context and overlapping stories and how all of these things happen at the same time and no one thing ever happens in a vacuum. And so I love finding eras of time and places where you can apply that concept. And I've got a couple more in the bag. I just need to kind of pull them out and flush them out a little bit, see if they've got merit, and then move forward with them. So there's a couple nonfiction books. Hopefully, I can shortcut the process. I've also got a whole library of potential fiction ideas that I would love to dive into when I have time. But oh man, I don't know when that time is going to be. Hopefully soon.
Wow. Wow. I was just looking at are you familiar with John Sayles?
The director, the
Yeah, right. He also won a bunch of literary awards. I was not aware of that. And he has a book out called A Moment in the Sun. It's like 1,200 pages long about what went on at the time of the Klondike gold rush up in Alaska. And I didn't even, it's like, oh my God, I didn't know this. I didn't know this. And it's a wonderful book. So I'm reading that too as I'm trying to do everything else. It's hard, but you're a young man. Opposed to me, you're a young man. You got plenty of years ahead of you that you could research and write and tell us stories. It's wonderful. Again, I do interviews. You do more narration. Have you ever done interviews type podcast?
I have done some interviews on the Legends of the Old West podcast and a little bit on Infamous America. Though we have really shied away from doing more interviews, in that we found the listeners just simply aren't all that interested. They some of them like it, but one of the many lessons we've learned is that once you get people hooked on a storytelling podcast, they just want to hear the next story. Some of them will listen to a random interview, with an author or a filmmaker or whatever, but mostly they want to hear the next story. And so my previous life, one of my a brief iteration of my previous life in working in the film industry in Hollywood was producing short form documentaries. And so I was behind the camera conducting interviews like you're doing. And so I've done a lot of that in my past, just not as much anymore in the podcast world.
Yeah, I know. My daughter said to me one time, Dad, why don't you just get authors on to talk about their books? I said, are people going to, do they want to come on and will people listen? And they are. Authors are coming, people are listening. I can't believe it. It's amazing. But I have such respect for guys like you who can sit there and do a narrative. I know. And you have the sound effects and then every now and then you get quotes from professors or from experts. Oh my God, I can't figure out how to do that. That's too much for my brain. You're wonderful.
Well, thank you.
I want to say thank you for coming on and being with us today on Books and Looks for our second time. I want to have you on a third, fourth, many times more in the future.
Thank you very much, Blaine. I appreciate it. I appreciate our continued conversation since our first chat about a year ago. We've kept in touch. That's how this second interview came around. I'm thankful and thrilled that you brought me back. And hopefully I can keep doing things to justify bringing me back. Hopefully there's new books and whatever else coming down the pike. We can find excuses to chat again.
Well, there you have it, friends. Another great interview with Chris Wimmer, who is just a fascinating guy with learning us so much about the Old West and what he's doing with books, podcasts, and who knows what else he's going to be doing. You don't want to miss that. You also don't want to miss going to viewsonbooks.com. I'll tell you why. the book review is on there. Over 1,200 people have read that book review. Again, it's not because I wrote it, but it's because how good that book is and what is covered. You want to go to there. And do us all a favor. Please subscribe, share, like, whatever you got to do. We appreciate it. So anyway, hey, listen, I'm not going to take up any more of your time. On behalf of viewsonbooks.com, on behalf of my good friends at Podcast Studio X, this is Blaine DeSantis for Books and Looks, saying may all your leaves be pages in a book.